Hello and welcome to this online lesson. I am Mr. Hoven, and today we will be talking about the presidency of Mr. James Monroe. After the War of 1812, 4th of July celebrations became more popular than ever. Americans were proud of their country. They were especially proud that the nation was growing rapidly. Improved transportation allowed the opening of new lands to settlers, and new industries were appearing. In Congress, a new generation of political leaders sought to direct this expansion. In 1816, the Republican candidate for president, James Monroe, easily defeated the Federalist Senator Rufus King of New York. The election showed how seriously the Federalist Party had declined in popularity, and many Federalists had joined the Republican Party and voted for Monroe. Monroe was the last Revolutionary War officer to become president. He was almost 60 years old when he took office, and he still followed the fashions of the late 1700s. Americans were fond of his old-fashioned ways. In 1817, he made a goodwill tour of the country. In Boston, crowds cheered for him enthusiastically. Newspapers expressed a surprise at this warm welcome for a Republican from Virginia. After all, Boston had long been a Federalist stronghold. Monroe hoped to create a new sense of national unity. One newspaper wrote that the United States was entering an era of good feelings, and by the time Monroe ran for a second term in 1820, no candidate opposed him, and the Federalist Party had disappeared. So while conflict between political parties declined, disputes between different sections of the nation sharpened. In Congress, three ambitious young men took center stage. All three would play key roles in Congress for more than 30 years, as well as serving in other offices. Each represented a different section of the country. John C. Calhoun was from the South. He had supported the War of 1812, and like many Southerners, he was a firm defender of slavery. He believed that it was okay. In general, he opposed policies that would strengthen the power of the federal government. Daniel Webster was from the North. He was from New Hampshire, and was perhaps the most skillful public speaker of his time. Like many New Englanders, Webster had opposed the War of 1812. He even refused to vote for taxes to pay for the war effort. And after the war, he wanted the federal government to take a larger role in building the nation's economy. Unlike Calhoun, Webster thought slavery was evil. And then there was Henry Clay of the West. You have already met him, and he was a leader of the Warhawks who pushed for war against Britain in 1812. But like Webster, Clay strongly favored a more active role for the central government in promoting the country's growth. So at this time, at the end of the War of 1812, British goods again began to pour into the United States. Because the British had a head start industrializing, they could make and sell goods more cheaply than Americans could. And sometimes, British manufacturers sold cloth in the United States for less than it cost to make. Their plan was to put American rivals out of business, then jack up the prices. Now, this plan caused dozens of New England businesses to fail, and angry owners begged Congress to pass a protective tariff on all imported goods from Europe. Again, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Congress did pass this tariff in 1816, and it greatly raised tariffs on imports and made imported goods more expensive than similar American-made goods. Higher tariffs led to angry protests from Southerners. Southerners had built few factories, and as a result, they did not benefit from the tariff. Also, Southerners bought many British goods. The new tariff drove up the price of British-made goods, and Southerners complained that the tariff made northern manufacturers rich at the expense of the South. This dispute over tariffs began the whole process of sectionalism, where people became more loyal to their section or state rather than the whole nation. So if you remember those three individuals we mentioned earlier, you had Calhoun of the South, Webster of the North, and Clay of the West. They represented the three sections of the United States at this time. And at this time, the Spanish Empire began losing colonies in Central and South America. By 1810, many people in Spain's American colonies were eager for independence, and they had many reasons to be unhappy. They demanded a role in government. Opposition to Spain was also growing among Native Americans, or natives. Harsh rules kept natives forever in debt, and all over Latin America, people were eager to be free of the Spanish. In 1816, José de San Martín led Argentina to freedom. In 1819, Simon Bolivar liberated the liberator, Colombia, from Spanish control. 1821, revolutionary forces took back control of Mexico. And by 1825, Spain lost all of its colonies in Latin America except Puerto Rico and Cuba. And Spain lost another one of its colonies, Florida. Not to independence, though, but to the United States. Many Americans wanted to gain possession of Florida. White Southerners were especially worried about disturbances across the border. Creek and Seminole natives in Florida sometimes raided settlements in Georgia. Also, Florida was a refuge for many enslaved African Americans. There was one settlement on the Apalachicola River known as the Negro Fort, which housed about 1,000 African Americans. General Andrew Jackson demanded that Spain demolish this fort. When the Spanish governor refused, the United States invaded Florida and destroyed the fort. In 1818, Jackson again headed to Florida with a force of more than 3,000 soldiers. Spain protested but did little else. It was busy fighting rebels in Latin America and could not risk war with the United States. In the end, Spain agreed to peace talks. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams worked out a treaty with Spain. In it, Spain agreed to give up Florida to the United States in exchange for $5 million. The Adams-Onis Treaty took effect in 1821. Americans cheered as Latin American nations won independence. The action of European powers, however, worried Secretary Adams and President Monroe. In 1815, Prussia, France, Russia, and Austria formed an alliance aimed at crushing any revolution that sprang up in Europe. They seemed ready to help Spain regain its colonies in Latin America. And in addition, Russian claimed lands on the Pacific coast of North America. President Monroe decided to act. In a message to Congress in 1823, he made a bold foreign policy statement known as the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe declared that the United States would not interfere in the affairs of the European nations or existing colonies of the European nations. At the same time, he warned European nations not to attempt to regain control of newly independent nations of Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine essentially drew a line in the sand. It stated that the United States would oppose any attempt to build colonies in the Americas. Monroe's message showed that the United States was determined to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. And as the United States became stronger and stronger, the Monroe Doctrine grew in importance. On several occasions, the United States successfully challenged European intervention or involvement in Latin America. And in the early 1900s, presidents also used the Monroe Doctrine to justify sending troops into Caribbean nations. Thus, Monroe's bold statement helped shape the United States foreign policy for more than 100 years. I hope you've enjoyed this online lesson. Next time, we'll be talking about President Andrew Jackson. We'll see you then.